Dear Eva Illouz, dear Offer Waldmann, dear guests, dear friends of the Jewish Museum Berlin. My name is Daniel Wildmann. I'm the head of the Michael Blumenthal Academy of the Jewish Museum Berlin. I would like to welcome you warmly to the fourth event of our new digital lecture series, Déjà Vu, a new search for old answers. For those who are with us for the first time, we invite our lecturers to join Offer Waldmann introducing German Jewish intellectuals of the 20th century to our audience and reading a selection of their writings still relevant today. In May, Delphine Aurieux discussed the question of secularizing classical Hebrew, meaning the invention of Ivrit, the modern Hebrew. She discussed this fascinating question based on a letter written by Gershom Scholem in 1926. In June, Moshe Sakal shared with us his questions about minority status, belonging, and diaspora based on Magnus Hirschfeld's writing and his trip to Mandatory Palestine in 1931. And in September, Joel Kupferberg brought our attention to Max Horkheimer and his thoughts about the so-called Bilderverbot, the ban on pictures. Horkheimer linked this idea to the need to always think critically about images and not to become one with an image. If you have missed one or several of these lectures and discussions, please feel free to go to our homepage and enjoy the video recordings. Today, we turn our attention to Jean Namery, born in Vienna in 1912. His essays, like, for example, Grenzen der Solidarität from 1977, or Mein Judentum from 1978, and the ones on left-wing anti-Semitism have been republished both in German and in French in 2024. Jean Namery, the former resistance fighter, concentration camp prisoner, and survivor of Auschwitz, describes and analyzes already 1969 left-wing anti-Zionism as what he calls ehrbarer Antisemitismus, virtuous anti-Semitism, a difficult-to-find form of contemporary anti-Semitism which separates him fundamentally from the New Left. According to Eva Illouz, Jean Namery stands for an orphaned Jewish consciousness. We are delighted that Offer Waldmann is hosting our digital lecture series. Offer holds a joint PhD in history and German literature and is the author of several books and radio plays. His first book, Singularkollektiv Erzählungen, was published by Wallstein Verlag in 2023. And in 2024, Offer and Sascha Marianne Salzmann published their correspondence about the world after October 7 under the title Gleichzeit. In 2021, Offer Waldmann was awarded the German Radio Play Prize for the production Adolf Eichmann, Ein Hörprozess. Offer is currently the head of the Heinrich Böll Foundation in Tel Aviv, and just in time for the Frankfurt Book Fair, the Wallstein Publishing House has published Offer's latest book entitled Verkämpftes Land, Beobachtungen aus Israel während des Krieges. How do we proceed today? Offer Waldmann, hi Offer, will introduce Eva Illouz, and her 20-minute presentation will be followed by a conversation between the two of you. Afterwards, the audience, you, our guests, will have the opportunity to ask questions in a Q&A session. Before we begin, I would thank my colleagues Anna Pollmann, Signe Rosbach, Katja Fatke and Falk Schneider for organizing this event. And we would also like to thank the Bertolt Leibinger Foundation for supporting the digital lecture series. We are truly grateful for your support. Dear Eva, dear Offer, I'm very, very happy to have you here with us, and Offer, over to you.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for this kind introduction. From me as well, thank you, dear staff of the Jewish Museum in Berlin, dear audience, it's great to have you here. And last but not least, dear Professor Eva Illouz, it is a pleasure and an honor to welcome you to the fourth session, as Daniel said, of Deja Vu, of our series embarking on a new search for old answers. Daniel touched upon Jean-Marie, the protagonist of our today's talk. And Jean-Marie writes about his youth in Vienna, and he writes about fist fights that he was engaged in against Nazis, and he complains. He complains that he wanted to get beaten up from political and not racial reasons. He wanted to get beaten up as a lefty and not as a Jew. And after reading the book, The New Anti-Semite, that you have recommended us, that has recently been published again, like Daniel said, with your with a few words of you in French, one gets the impression that not only the Nazis have denied him of their not only political fists, but also the left during the 60s and the 70s did not accept him to the roles of the left as a Jew. You can't get beaten up as a lefty, and you cannot send your fists, verbal or physical, as a sovereign state of Israel or as a diasporic Jew, as a lefty, but only as a Jew. So, as Daniel said, we talked today about Jean-Marie, who was born in Austro-Hungary as Hans Meyer, tortured by the Nazis, survived Auschwitz, and became one of the prominent intellectual voices in Europe of the 60s and 70s until he took his own life. A lefty Jew caught between his upheld ressentiment against Germany and his melancholy within his own political camp, the left, in which he discovers in the discussion about Israel following the 6 Days War, the same offsprings of anti-Semitism which already denied him in his youth to get, as I just said, to get beaten up as a lefty and not as a Jew. And we have the true pleasure to talk about Jean-Marie today with Professor Eva Illouz. I just told Eva that I had the pleasure of being her student almost 20 years ago at the Hebrew University. Eva Illouz serves as the director of the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. Her research interests include the sociology of culture, emotions, and capitalism, in particular the impact of consumer culture and mass media on emotional patterns. Eva Illouz is the author of 17 books on topics as diverse as romantic love, the emergence of psychological culture in the 20th century, the happiness industry, and the impact of technology and modernity on emotions. Her books have been translated into 23 languages, and her work has won numerous international awards, and she also publishes regularly in different newspapers in Germany, especially in the Süddeutsche Zeitung, in Haaretz, in Israel, and in different newspapers across the world. Now, following Jean-Marie from a distance of more than half a century, Eva Illouz writes in her newly published essay that was published in Germany in Zokamp under the title Der 8. Oktober, and I quote, "Until October 7th, 2023, I believe that crimes against humanity were the last events that could still bring together divergent beliefs and opinions in a moral community of compassion. And it seemed to me that the political sensibility most likely to be outraged by atrocities was mine, the left. I was wrong," writes Eva Illouz. Maybe a feeling that Eva Illouz shares with Jean-Marie. We will find out, dear Professor Illouz. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ofer. I'm delighted to see you and delighted to be hosted by the Jewish Museum in Berlin. I'm going to talk about the preface of my book, I haven't prepared something separate, so I thought that these words were, in fact, what I had to say about Jean-Marie. I turned to him after October 7th, a bit by chance, because I felt, like many, a great sense of disorientation and even panic at the kind of inversion we witnessed immediately in the aftermath of the massacres of October 7th, the inversions about the guilty parties. So I'm not talking at all about what happened later the conduct of the war, etc. I'm talking only about these first few days and the sense of complete loss of orientation I experienced, because it was, as I said, and as you quoted, my camp, who inversed, in fact, reality and even moral categories. And I was stunned to discover that Jean Amery, whom I had admired greatly before, had actually understood everything in these writings on anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, which he wrote between 1966 and 1978, or no, 1976, I think. So these are a few thoughts I'm going to deliver regarding this very important book, and incredibly prescient already of what was going to happen. Jean Amery is, I think, one of the first intellectuals to think with Auschwitz. I think the only one who might have preceded him is Theodor Adorno. For Adorno, Auschwitz marked a radical rupture in history of thinking, of thought. It marked a kind of collapse of the entire philosophy and the eruption of the category of the impossible. In fact, it is as if the very category of the impossible was negated by itself, the void being voided itself. To think with Auschwitz meant, in fact, not to be able to think at all. It meant being deprived of language. This is why, as you remember, of course, after Auschwitz, poetry is no longer possible. It is, in fact, an act of barbarity. This way of approaching Auschwitz, it is important to note, is quite different from Hannah Arendt, who thought about Auschwitz, but not with Auschwitz. So Arendt, I think, lacked completely the kind of philosophical pathos that haunts Amery's thinking, and even Adorno to a certain extent. And Arendt displaced the metaphysical question which they raise onto a question of what I would call political psychology. She simply asks, what is the political psychology that made the genocide possible? She viewed in Auschwitz a kind of defeat of thinking, but it was thinking without a majuscule, without a big T. It was not the collapse of thought she was interested in, but simply she was interested in a kind of lack of cognitive and moral capacities of the individual. That is, the lack of capacity of Eichmann to think for himself. She did not think about the metaphysical collapse that preoccupied Adorno and Amery. And so Arendt viewed Eichmann as the speaker, the carrier of a language that was already made, of a kind of thinking that was already made. And she wanted, or she called for, a kind of language that is non-ideological and non-contaminated. That means that for Arendt, in fact, Western philosophy remained intact. That is not the case for Amery, because, as I said, Amery did not think about Auschwitz, he thought with Auschwitz. This is why Amery is much closer to Adorno than Arendt. As Ofer said, he was imprisoned in the tragically famous camp, but it is not, I think, this event which structures his thinking. For him, Auschwitz was the paradigm and the end, or the realization of a kind of deep logic that existed much before and which he needed to if not interpret or decipher, at least to describe. And this is why in his famous book, Beyond Crime and Punishment, I'm not sure how it's called in English, Ameri, like Adorno, viewed Auschwitz as the kind of implacable conclusion of a logic which made null, in fact, non-existing, which negated the whole philosophical corpus of Western civilization. It meant that you could no longer use language, the German language at least. And Auschwitz, in fact, marked the failure of language itself. And what Auschwitz, in fact, destroyed is the Geist, the spirit itself. But in the collection of essays, this collection of essays that he wrote between 1966 and 1968 and 1960 and 1976, he marks himself as different from Adorno because what interests him much more, I think, than Adorno is Jewish existence. For Ameri, Auschwitz was paradigmatic of what it meant to be a Jew, not be, in fact, what it meant about the Jewish fact of being. To be a Jew for Ameri is not a belief, it's not a practice, and it's not a memory. It is a very specific form of existence in the Sartrean meaning of that word. What characterizes this existence, you may ask? It is to never be far from the catastrophe. It is to live waiting for the catastrophe to come. It is to be designated, chosen, named by others. It is to wait that someone comes to knock our door to invite us to meet with the authorities, with the police, or simply to expel us or to destroy our house. A Jew, as Ameri famously said it, is a dead on furlough. So Ameri refuses to see Auschwitz as a catastrophe which concerns the entire human species. He refused this move. He reminds us that it is first and foremost the catastrophe of the Jews. And if for Sartre, freedom is the first condition, the first and inexorable, necessary condition of existence, for the Jew, it is the opposite. The Jew is the one who is, from the outset, the one for whom others have chosen for him or her. And the Shoah is nothing but an event which, in fact, signs, ends, marks this act of designation. He says, society wanted me Jew, so I only had to accept the verdict. To withdraw into subjectivity from which I could have said that I did not feel Jewish would have been a fairly uninteresting game and a very private one at that. It is only 10 years later that I read in Réflexions sur la question juive by Sartre that to be a Jew is to be considered by others a Jew. And it was my case, end of quote. So to think with Auschwitz, it is to think first and foremost about the inexorability of this act of designation and to think of it as constitutive of Jewish existence. Ameri would not have been recognized as a Jew by Orthodox rabbis. In fact, he didn't want to be a Jew. He was raised Catholic. the Judaism as a religion or even as a culture were completely foreign to him. And even though he was raised in a very assimilated Austrian family whose mother was Catholic, the Jewish origin of his father did not count at all in his personal story, but it was enough to make him designated as a Jew by the Nazis. After his experience in Auschwitz, Amiri will never go back to his Austrian identity. In fact, he will reject and deny such identity so much that he will change his name, and he will continue to endorse, espouse, embrace the identity of the pariah. To be a Jew was imposed on him, but, and this was, I think, the ultimate act of resistance of his life. After Auschwitz, he chose freely to be a Jew. It is this double movement of negation and affirmation, of being closed up or imprisoned by the designation of others and freedom, which constitutes the existential position of the intellectual who thinks with Auschwitz. Auschwitz did not make Adorno or Arendt Zionists. I mean, Arendt stopped being Zionist very quickly. But for Amiri, it is the opposite that happened. He says, my personal relations with this country, which Thomas Mann qualified in his tetralogy of Joseph as a Mediterranean country, not especially welcoming, a bit dusty and stony. Yeah, and he says, my relationships are non-existent. I never visited it. I do not speak its language. Its civilization is pathetically foreign to me. Its religion is not mine. And yet, the existence of this state entity is more important for me than that of any other. End of quote. So Amiri is a Zionist because only Zionism enables him to escape the determinations that are imposed by others. And this is what marks the profound originality of his thinking with regard to German intellectual Jews after the war. He understands that Zionism articulates differently the Jewish existence, and that for the first time it enables Jews not only to choose themselves, but also to walk, as he puts it, with their head high. I quote, for any Jew in the world, whatever his political position, whether it is an intellectual, a tradesperson, or craftsman, the survival of the tiny Jewish state is an existential question, because the Jews learned in Israel, as Ernst Bloch holds it in another context, to walk with their head high, and have given the example of what it means to walk firmly, even to diaspora Jews, and even though to those who have absolutely no intention whatsoever to visit Israel, even for a holiday. Soon after, however, end of quote, soon after the emergence of the country, the old determination of Jewish existence by others started to re-emerge. He was not the only one to think that anti-Semitism could survive to its official disappearance. In fact, Adorno himself thought it, and he was one of the first to suggest that anti-Semitism has all but died. And Adorno had theorized this phenomenon, which he attributed to the kind of remnants of type of thinking which wanted to simplify the world, understanding of the world, and to what he called the authoritarian personality. So I'll just say a word or two about this because I think it's really interesting and it applies very much to the left. Adorno suggested the concept of ticket to refer to anti-Semitism. Not, of course, ticket to take the bus, but the sense of an electoral ticket. Anti-Semitism was an element of a ticket, of a whole ideological package. And in this, it contained 4 elements. 1, anti-Semitism is no longer an isolated opinion, but a part of an ideological conglomerate. You could say in the past, the fascist ticket, and now you can say the progressive ticket. 2, anti-Semitism is not a personal conviction or opinion. Rather, it enables to join a camp that is already well constituted, a camp which conceives of the world with stereotypes and clear values, a camp which forgoes voluntarily nuance and complexity and even thinking. 3, ideology comes in the form of ideological clusters and give rise to a Ticketmentalität. This is the expression that Adorno uses, Ticketmentalität. That is a mentality which characterizes all ideologies from the right and from the left, and which consists in a kind of depersonalization of thinking, an espousal en bloc of ideologies, which in turn stifles the very capacity to judge. We have seen that very much after October 7, how all the progressive causes were encapsulated into the single heading of the hatred for Israel. And finally, this may be the most provocative and mysterious aspect of Adorno's argumentation. The fact that there are no longer anti-Semitic opinions does not mean there is no longer anti-Semitism. In fact, Adorno says anti-Semitism is not simply a characteristic of a ticket, it has become characteristic of any mentality accepting tickets. So really, Adorno is saying something about our mode of political thinking. It is a form of thought which lacks judgment and which accepts en bloc a kind of orientation to the world. So for Adorno, so for Amory, things are a bit different. And I wonder sometimes who, I think he was no less clairvoyant, in fact, than Adorno, but he was more clairvoyant in that he deciphered much better than Adorno did the new political landscape in the West after the 1960s. He understands that anti-Semitism is now in the camp of emancipation of the left, whereas for Adorno suspected simply fascism to be still at work in democracies. It will be the left anti-Zionism which will take charge of putting the Jews back to their ancient place, to their ancient seat, which will intimate to them to walk with their head not too high, not to forget their guilt and their shame, their ontological guilt and their ontological shame. I quote, the Jewish human condition has tragically exempted the Jew of his choice, as it was the case in the past. This does not mean that there is not for him a terrible dilemma to the extent that he's from the left, that the Jew is from the left, because it continues in Vietnam. Vietnam is here and demands the solidarity of the leftist Jew, of the committed leftist Jew, even if, he says, even if Hanoi has sent a telegraph to Nasser, reassuring Nasser of its wholehearted support. How then, he asks, to escape the dilemma? End of quote. So what Amoury is telling us is that there is not only an existential condition of the Jews, but if I may say so, there is an existential condition of left-wing Jews. Jean Amoury was, I think, one of the first to understand that there was a new kind of anti-Semitism, although, of course, left-wing anti-Semitism dates from the 19th century. But he is one of the first to understand that the anti-imperialist ideologies of the 1970s impose on the left-wing Jew to choose. In fact, what Amoury is telling us is that of all Jews, perhaps it is the left-wing Jew who is the least free. Why? Because of the virtuous anti-Semitism, which is now contained in anti-Zionism. And such virtuous anti-Semitism really builds a contradiction between morality and being a Jew, between walking with your head high as a Jew and between walking your head high as a human being. So the intellectual and moral crisis that we live since October 7th, I think, has largely confirmed, alas, Amoury's diagnostic. The anti-imperialist left does not want, I think, anything but the political or physical existence of Israel. And even though there is absolutely no doubt that Amoury would have been horrified by the theocracy that exists in Israel, and I am sure that Netanyahu would have seemed to him repugnant, and he would have been nauseous in front of the bombing of Gaza, the endless bombing of Gaza, or between the alliance between Donald Trump and the Israeli government. But he would have thought also that this eminently imperfect state remains necessary and that the left cannot construct a world without anti-Semitism. October 7th then has made us orphans, us meaning the Jews and the left-wing Jews. It has made us orphans of politics. Jean Amoury is the great intellectual of our epoch because there was very few consciousness that are as orphan as he was. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eva Illouz, for these I must say disturbing words. I think you describe perhaps I would use the word loneliness that emerges from this stance. It's, by the way, it's you just talked about contradictions. I will start with an entry point. You also asked for Jean Amoury the question, what is a Jew? Is it something that is it his own definition, an autonomous or a heteroautonomous definition? And he writes about himself actually that he grew up not with real Jews, and then he tells us what are real Jews. Jews are Jews who are fully aware to their problems and are politically conscious. And this is what he writes at the beginning of his book. And what is this political consciousness for Jean Amoury? First of all, the resentment that he's known for. The resentment is the moral stance of the victim vis-a-vis Germany. But then in his book, he also writes about the melancholy of the lefty Jew that is left alone within his own camp. And I must say that I ask myself, is Jean Amoury writing what he's writing as a Holocaust survivor, a lefty Jewish Holocaust survivor who tries to stand up for the case of Israel vis-a-vis the left? Or does he try in a way to save the case of the global left camp? to save the moral stance of the global left camp. And this is something that I admit that I also read between the lines when I read your recent publication. Or is it neither? Is it neither nor? What would you say?
My sense is that he gave up on the left. I mean, he was shunned by the left, and he says so. He says that he's shunned, and he says that he doesn't care. And at that moment of time, I think he is most definitely, he chose his camp. That's what in fact, he chose twice. He chose to be a Jew after the war, when he could have reverted to his non-Jewish identity. And he chose a second time to stand with the Jews and with Israel when his political camp. So in that sense, you could say that there is something mysterious, because it's not clear what is exactly that the foundation of the identity which would make him renounce his home, his many homes, his national home, and then his political home, to espouse the cause of a pariah. I think this is what makes him such a unique voice. It's precisely this capacity to not go with the crowd. This is the opposite. He is the perfect opposite, in fact, of the ticket mentalitat that I referred to about Adorno.
Yeah. But then the question rises, one of the main points that we've heard in discussions within the Jewish world, within the left Jewish world, is this tension between Jewish particularity, Israeli sovereignty, for instance, and lefty universalism. And I mean, he writes after he visits Israel. I admit that I read his report after he came back from Israel. It's written. It's a part of the book that was recently published. It sounds in a way almost confused. He refers to Israel in different places as a way, the Museum of Anthropology, as a monument, as a virtual asylum. He's embarrassed in a way by certain features of Israel that he has seen. But then again, he writes, and I quote, "Anyone who questions Israel's right to exist is either too stupid to realize that they are contributing to the creation of a super Auschwitz, or they are consciously working towards the super Auschwitz." So basically, he answers the question between the universalism of the left and Jewish particularity, as expressed through the sovereignty of the state of Israel. And I agree with you that talking about the 6 Days War is one thing. Talking about the war since October 7th is something different. But he makes a choice. So by making this choice, does he basically say there is no room left in the true sense of the word? There is no room left between the particularity and the universalism. There is no lefty Jewish stance, besides maybe the stance of the pariah, not belonging to any camp.
I'm not sure exactly how to take your question. Well, let us think about us today. If there is something that the left has endlessly argued since the 1970s, it has abandoned, consciously rejected universalism, and has struggled to establish the particularity of communities, causes, cultures, and so on and so forth. Strangely enough, the particularity of the Jewish case, if I may say so, is maybe the only one where this is not acceptable. This is exactly where the language of universalism is sometimes in a self-contradictory way used, because Israel is, it is, how shall I put it, practically demonized for not following the model of Western democracies. Now, understand me, it's not that Israel doesn't have many problems, and it's not that I don't think that there are many things that should be fixed very urgently in its political organization for it to be a better society. Of course, there are many defects. But I think a great deal of the demonization of Israel and the lack of understanding of what Israel represents comes from the fact that Israel is a Jewish state. It is the very fact that it exists as a Jewish state that probes many to demand one state, which would actually mean the disappearance of a Jewish state. So in that sense, if you want, from me, right now, the left uses universalist language in a completely opportunistic way. It uses particularity and identity for some groups, and it uses universalism for Israel. I don't know if I responded to you.
Yeah, it is indeed. It's one sees the challenge, and by the way, one of the methods that are used back then for Ameri, he describes it in his book. We know it from the Historikerstreit from Germany, from the famous correspondence between Shaul Friedlander and Martin Borchardt. The fact that Jews cannot participate in the discussion about Israel because they're not objective enough, they're denied of the right of participation. And we see it all the way to our days that discussing what is going on in Israel, in Palestine, in the Middle East as a whole, that the participation in this discussion is being denied of Jewish intellectuals because they're perceived as non-objective regarding Israel. I think it's interesting. You refer to him as a Zionist. Like Daniel said before, our last conversation was about Horkheimer with Yael Kupferberg, and Horkheimer perceives Israel as imposing on the Jews in the world a political identity. Would you say now that because of especially these last 2 years, that Jews are being imposed by Israel, but by what is going on and a political identity, that there is no escape of a political stance as a Jew because what is going on in Israel, and what does it mean for the Jewish diaspora?
So I think there are two things that are imposing themselves here. Israel imposes itself in the sense that most Jews, whether they are anti-Zionist or Zionist, in fact, situate themselves vis-a-vis Israel. So that is undoubtable. But what also is imposing itself is the first one, a demonization of Israel, and by association, demonization of any Jew which associates with Israel. I do not know how much this is felt in Germany, but this is certainly felt in many parts of the world where declaring that you are a Zionist would almost automatically qualify you. It would be almost like declaring that you're a Nazi. So these are two different types of assignations. And Israel did not choose the second, but it exists very powerfully. Now, I would say that if you look at the numbers, the majority of young Gen Z Americans, Jewish Americans, are anti-Zionist. They define themselves as anti-Zionist. That is, they do not want to have anything to do with Israel. What exactly this says about their Jewish identity or identification about the Jews, I do not know. But certainly the Jews, in fact, are still free, if that is freedom, to simply disaffiliate and disregard completely the whole issue. So I would say, yes, Israel imposes itself, but it imposes itself because the question has been posed as if whether you are in the party of humanity or in the party of the Jews. And this actually, Ameri saw exactly that this is how the left was asking and posing the question. It was exactly calling on the Jew to choose between his humanity and between his Jewishness. And this is, I think, something that we do not ask of any other group, and it's a good thing too. The only group we ask this from is from the Jews.
You've mentioned on the word generation. And Jean-Emery also talks about generation. He talks about the young generation of European lefties who feel themselves freed, perhaps, from the burden of the Second World War. The generational, I would say, the generational perspective is in Germany as well one of the major, most effective instruments or tools in looking into social history. But let's look a little bit at the generation question within European Jews. There was a generation in Germany and in Austria of communist Jews who were in a situation in between, I would say now, maybe a little bit bluntly, the ghetto, seclusion, and the Israel sovereignty. They were not part of neither this nor that. They were in between and saw themselves as communist Jews. In the GDR in Eastern Germany, they tried to assimilate themselves, the so-called red assimilation, which did not work. Maybe the lefty Jewish stance of Jean Amery is actually a socio-historical phenomenon of his generation, not possible before and not possible after, vis-a-vis what is going on in Israel now. You talked about the theocracy that is coming to be in Israel, vis-a-vis what the current Israeli government has done in the past few years within Israel, outside of Israel. Maybe it was a socio-historical stance, a position that was very specific to the middle of the 20th century and cannot be anymore.
That's not the opinion of many, many Jews. I mean, many Jews like me oppose fiercely what's happening in Israel and still think that there is no way back, and that for Jews to exist without a state would be a catastrophe. So I think there you really have now to what I see in the left, at least. I mean, this certainly is true for the right and those who support Bibi. I think there are those who are politically minded and who view the state as a necessity, however imperfect it is. Most states are very imperfect. Most countries are extremely imperfect, in fact. And he says himself, there is no country that is not based on an injustice. So that means that he has, to a certain extent, he has accepted the injustice, the accusation of injustice against Israel, that Israel is an unjust state. He has accepted it by saying it is an unjust state, but all other states are also unjust. And we're not going now to start contesting the right of existence of all states. So that is, I would say, the statist position. I think there is another very active, especially in the United States, part of the liberal left, which talks about the Jewish soul, the Jewish spirit, the humanist values of Judaism, and which views Israel, contemporary Israel, as a betrayal, as a fundamental betrayal of this Jewish soul. And these two groups actually cannot meet each other, I think. They cannot meet each other because one is using, I think, a kind of political rationality, and the other one is referring to a kind of mystical notion of the Jewish soul, which frankly I find dislikable. I don't think Jews are better than any other people at all. I don't think that Judaism or Jewish religion is better or has more humanist principles as others at all. If any religion has, for me, it is Christianity, much more than Judaism or Islam. So I don't think, but for these Jews, indeed, the state of Israel is not legitimate anymore because it is a betrayal of that kind of transhistorical essence of what they attribute to the Jewish people. And I think it is a romantic view of the Jews. It is perhaps it even hides in itself the view that Jews are kind of morally superior and that they have the right to existence only if they are morally superior to others. So I'm extremely suspicious of that kind of mobilization of the beautiful soul, what Yankelevich, the French philosopher, had called the sublime Jew, the sublime Jew. There are many Jews who want to be sublime. And I would, my position is actually quite similar to Amaury. I think we're not better than other human beings. And the only things we ask is to be left alone to live like other human beings who are not perfect.
Yeah, I agree with you indeed that there is a whole generational group in the, especially in the United States, but not only in the United States. I would even say in parts in Israel and in the exile Israeli communities you see in different places, for instance, in Berlin, in Germany, that are, I would say, embarrassed from practicing Jewish sovereignty in the form of the state of Israel.
Absolutely.
And because Germany, in a way, is defined or defines itself through its basic law, its constitution, through its socio-cultural heritage, by what it perceives or what is being perceived as the two legacies of the Second World War. First, the human rights, the universalistic human rights, and the second is solidarity with the Jewish people vis-a-vis Israel. And the past few years have created a contradiction, and in a way that's one of the reasons for the I would say very complex reaction in Germany, this embarrassment by practicing of Jewish sovereignty. I will have a look as promised now to the to see
I just
if
want to
our
say something
please.
to what you just said, but very shortly. I will say I completely understand the embarrassment, and I completely understand the sense of perplexity and disorientation. I completely understand that. On the other hand, perhaps Germany has a very unique knowledge, not memory, and note that I don't say memory, a knowledge of what it means to hate these people with such passion, with incredible passion, and with a sense of absolute moral righteousness. And so perhaps Germany knows something that other countries don't, which is that this is a form of hatred that is quite perhaps unique in the history of mankind. And, you know, I don't think it is a bad thing to keep that knowledge. Although, again, I understand the perplexity, and I find myself constantly in exactly that same crossroad and that same sense of disorientation sometimes.
Especially if you looking at the streets of Germany, looking at the student movements of Germany, the current historical moment is the rally point. What is the past few years, the past 2 years, the war in Gaza is in a way 68 for a whole generation. And the question, what will it do? What will it do to the legacy of the Second World War as it has been textually preserved in the German constitution, with a whole generation of young Germans now who I would say became politically conscious around Gaza, around the pictures from Gaza, around the demonstrations. I would like to ask you, in your recent book, you basically show that anti-Semitism is not only a problem, I mean, definitely not only a problem of the Jews or of Israel, but it's also, you talked before about reminiscence, that anti-Semitism in a way is a symptom of a deeper disease of, I would say, of enlightened thought of academia, of what you refer to as authoritarian science. So in a way you try, I would say maybe I go too far to rescue the conversation about being a universalistic lefty Jew, and to say that talking about anti-Semitism is in a way to find a way to object this authoritarian science object this disease, this misdevelopment of academia of our times. Is that so?
I completely agree with you. I think that's, I mean, what happened was, for me, was I experienced what happened as a semantic collapse, where the categories we had to evaluate the world were simply completely disjointed and disarticulated from the world. And I think that the kind of thinking we have been promoting, and which I have myself learned, this kind of thinking, which has made, for example, structures and power the fundamental concepts with which we approach the social world, are in fact defeated completely by the Israeli case, by the case of the Jews in Israel. This is when we see that a form of thinking is simply not working. And it is not working not because it is simply a single case that doesn't fit, but I think because the whole mode of thinking is just wrong. So, as often happens with the Jews, they crystallize around them broader crisis. Here I think I would say it's a crisis of it's a very deep intellectual crisis of how we analyze, how we go about analyzing the world, and throwing words like, you know, genocide and anti-Zionism as the condition for morality, and so on and so forth.
So again, you would say the Jews are the colibri in the mind, this time in the mind of enlightened lefty thought, to, as you said, crystallize or make clear how deep the crisis of today's academia goes.
I think we are experiencing, that would be an understatement to say we are experiencing a crisis of democracy. This was the case in the 1930s, and this is the case today. And as in the 1930s, it is again the Jews who experience this most deeply. So I think the next stage would be to really analyze how the crisis of democracy and the crisis of thinking around Israel and the Jews are connected.
It's way more frustrating as it has been, as it takes place within the camp that defines itself as democratic. I think this is maybe one of the challenges of our time.
Yeah.
I would take the chance.
I just want to say this. Just think about this. That 1,200 people are burnt alive, shot, tortured. All this is made visible through GoPro camera. And we know now that Yahya Sinwar intended to actually terrorize, to create an effect of terror. And I think the effect of terror was felt not only in Israelis, but on many, many people. And think that after that, the day after, we're talking about the day after, people write petitions to say it is Israel which is guilty. Now, you know, I found it just fascinating. If anyone, including, let's say, the Hamas or Daesh, if I had known that Daesh civilians, that the women and the children in a Daesh camp had been murdered by, say, Americans, who would have even thought of the day after writing and signing a petition? Just think about this. It is that what happened was something extremely strange. And I don't think we have dwelt enough on the radical strangeness of that reaction. Okay, so even, even if it had happened, let's say 2 weeks after, when Israel started bombing, even though Israel had, according to international law, Israel had the perfect right to defend itself. Let's say if it had started 2 weeks later, then I don't think I would have been as amazed. Do you know anyone who would write or sign a petition? And these petitions were circulated among universities, in universities, and by artists. Nan Goldin wrote one. It was signed by thousands of international artists. And Harvard, for example, had no less than 33 students' petitions of that sort circulating. Now, we should just pause a moment and contemplate that fact. It is outrageous by any. It is more than outrageous. It really defies comprehension.
I was following your writing after, not only after October 7th, but also after October 7th, and yourself and others expressed this feeling of loneliness within
Moral
the left
shock.
camp.
Moral shock.
Yeah. I will read some of the questions, interesting questions we get from our audience. Thank you for that. I will start with Andy, who asks, if Amari's argument that we need Israel, that the Jewish people needs Israel in order to walk with their head held high, I would read it as Israel as a nation state following a Western model is actually imposing an Ashkenazi experience onto all Jews.
Look, Zionism was an Ashkenazi phenomenon. I cannot do anything to change that. It was, created by Ashkenazi socialists and communists. And I mean, the basis of it is completely Ashkenazi. It doesn't mean it was allowed to treat as poorly, as scandalously, the Jews from Arab countries as it did. Of course not. But the foundation of Zionism is completely Eastern European. And it's just what it is.
Another question, which is, you referred to it when we talked about the Gen Z, but it goes, for instance, in Germany, there are many liberal Jews, or I would even say liberal Jewish Israelis, who assume anti-Zionist stances within Germany, and in doing so, and I quote here from the question, sanctify most forms of modern anti-Semitism. How to counter their widespread and often blatant tokenization by the left. And I can also add that we've seen in the past few years that conservative forces from Israel have allied with far-right forces. I mean, we've seen today that, what is his name, the far-right leader from the UK has visited Israel.
Robinson,
he was invited by Amichai Shikli from the Israeli government. So we see I would say in a way, an interference of the inner Israeli political discussion with the inner European political discussions regarding Israel, where both camps in Europe know how to use their Israelis for their political causes. So how do you confront that?
I actually believe, I hate to say this sentence, I sound like a stupid politician. I believe I was the first to write about this 10 years ago, when Netanyahu went to Hungary and met with Orban. And I think it is, I understand the rationale. The rationale is realpolitik. Realpolitik is the following one. We have the world against us, so let's take whichever allies we can. It is, however, extremely disturbing that Israel is now giving some kind of legitimacy to anti-Semites. So that is one of the most poignant ironies of history, if you want.
Yep.
But I would say that it's not exactly for the same reasons that they ally with each other. I think the extreme right allies with Israel in many places for two reasons. One is that it enables them to shake of their image the association with Nazism and anti-Semitism. So Israel helps them to whiten their image, whiten in the sense of, well, that's, in the sense of making more respectable. I apologize
legitimacy,
for using a very bad word. And then they ally with Israel because Israel offers a model they want for their own country, which is an ethnic democracy. And Israel offers, according to them, the model for that kind of ethnic democracy. They want it for the whites only or for the Christians only. And they think that Israel represents that model. So these are two horrible reasons for them, I think, to ally with Israel. I think Israelis are often aware who they are dealing with. They're not completely idiotic, although they sometimes are. But on that score, they are not completely idiotic, but they're taking alliances wherever they can. That's my reading of it.
There are two questions here that ask, perhaps, Jeanne-Marie and Sartre and others talking about Israel. They talked about Israel of the 60s and the 70s. They did not talk about Israel of 2025. And another question here touches upon the question, why is a Jewish state necessary for those Jews who live in the diaspora? And before I let you answer these questions, it reminded me of actually a part that I took out of the book of Améry, in a way a prophecy at the end of his book, that he talks about the existential solidarity pact between the Jewish diaspora and the state of Israel. And he writes, it contains no clause providing for its termination. Nevertheless, he writes, and precisely for this reason, it is the duty of the contracting parties, diaspora and Israel, in the diaspora, to warn their partners in Israel and to tell them in no uncertain terms, in the knowledge that the fundamental contract cannot be terminated, to tell them to watch out. And he concludes in very prophetic words, do not allow, I quote, do not allow the unbreakable solidarity that binds us, diaspora in Israel, to you, to become a community of disaster, Gemeinschaft der Katastrophe, going down together. Is his, would you say that his prophecy, at least to some extent, was fulfilled, that it became a Gemeinschaft, eine Katastrophengemeinschaft, a community of catastrophe? And is Israel today still a necessity for every Jew living in the world?
I don't know to answer this question. I don't like to be normative, and I don't want to tell the Jews what should be or should not be necessary for them. So let's remember that most diasporic Jews did not choose to go to Israel. It was, for a lot of them, a default option. And so history shows that most Jews did not think that they needed Israel's existence to live. So, for example, if we take the American Jews, because these are the only, it's only Israel and the United States. The rest doesn't really matter. It's too small. American Jews believed that liberalism, and after World War II, liberal institutions, and after World War II, the liberal institutions, the rule of law, Supreme Court, and so on and so forth, would protect them, as well as I think they felt protected by the memory of the Shoah. this has come to an end. I do not think this is any longer the truth if you self-identify as a Jew. You can, of course, choose to not identify and to not be a Jew, and things will be fine and dandy for you. But if you do identify as a Jew, I do not think many Jews still feel protected by the memory of the Shoah or by the rule of law. First of all, because it has collapsed, not only for the Jews, but for everybody. So I'm sorry, there were too many things I kind of forget. So I cannot say for the Jews what is or is not a necessity. Empirically, we can see that most Jews did not choose to go to live in Israel. It has become, however, important for their existence. But the problem is different. I do not think that is the right question to ask. I mean, could you envisage, can the world live morally with the disappearance of Israel now that it exists? In my opinion, no. In my opinion, it would be, I mean, you know, the Shoah happened in Europe and it marked a profound, mostly in Europe. It happened also in Arab countries, but mostly in Europe. But if Israel disappeared, I think it would mark severe stain, more than a stain. It would be a mark of infamy on the history of the world. So it's a completely different question. I mean, I don't care what the Jews do. They choose what they want. Now that Israel exists, it would be an infamy. However badly run this country is, it has the right, like other countries, to exist now that it exists.
With these words, unfortunately, because I look at the time, so with these words, I thank you cordially, Eva Iluz, for our conversations, for your thoughts, for inviting us to reread Jean Amery. I admit that it was not an easy experience to read these words of him resonating from the distance of the centuries. I thank our audience for posing the questions. I thank again Daniel Wildman and the team of the Jewish Museum in Berlin. And again, Eva Iluz, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
And
Thank
for
you,
all who are
Ofer.
watching, goodbye and thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.